What did you want to be when you grew up? What did you dream of being as a child? There once was this young boy whose dad decided to take him to an air show for the very first time. And they went to this air show and they wandered amongst the planes on the ground, and the father identified every single one of the planes to the young boy. And the boy was mesmerized by these beautiful planes on the ground. They walked up to this huge one so big that it was called a galaxy. And the little boy stood in the gaping wide mouth of this huge freight plane. It dwarfed him incredibly. They stood in lineups, and the little boy got to sit in the cockpit of a helicopter. They stood in another lineup, and he got to sit in the cockpit of a jet fighter. And then the father led the little boy over to the grass, and they sat down on the grass and looked up at the sky as biplanes began to fly by, doing stunts, and there were even some crazy people who stood out on the wing. And then came the World War II planes, pretending to dogfight as they went back and forth across the sky, pretending to shoot at each other, and the boy was mesmerized in awe of this battle or this pretend battle going on. And then came the jets, and he saw something that isn't very common. The Concorde went flying by. And then the snowbirds came and began to dance across the sky with their contrails, leaving colors to be blown away by the wind. And then after that dance ended, the roar of jet engines as two blue streaks came across the sky, followed by more blue streaks, and the Blue Angels soared by. And this young boy was mesmerized, went wow at these planes that flew around. And it was that moment that that little boy dreamed of being a pilot, but not just any pilot. No, being the greatest pilot there ever was. A few years later, the space shuttle Columbia blasted off. And now, this young boy dreamed of not just being the greatest pilot, but the greatest astronaut, of someday flying in jet fighters and then in the space shuttle itself. That little boy was me. And my dad took me to an air show. And I dreamed of being a pilot someday. And then as I got older, I realized I'm scared of heights. And that didn't work out so well. What did you dream of being as a child? Do you remember what that was? Did you dream of being a police officer? Did you dream of being a firefighter? Did you dream of being a jet fighter, an astronaut, an Olympian? What did you dream of being as a child? A teacher, a doctor, a nurse? One thing I know that we all share in common of all of our childhood dreams, whether you dreamed of being in the NHL or you dreamed of being in a classroom, one thing I know is that we all dreamed of being the greatest at whatever it is we dreamed of. No child ever dreams of being a mediocre fireman, right? No one ever dreams of just getting by. We all dream of being the greatest, don't we? It's something we all share. In fact, everybody since time began has dreamed of being great. In Ecclesiastes, the author there says that God has made everything beautiful in its time. That means that our life is beautiful just as it is right now. And then he goes on, he says, but he also has placed eternity in the hearts of humanity, even though they can't fathom it. And what he's saying there, or what the author is saying, is that everything is beautiful in its time. We have a beautiful life, and yet we always long for something more. We call it greatness. We long for something more. Sometimes we call it legacy. We long to be known long after we leave this planet. We long to be remembered by the people around us. We long to build a name and to have people to look at us and to say, there goes a great person. We long to be great. And yet the author of Ecclesiastes says that for some reason we can't seem to figure out where true greatness lies. How do we grasp hold of the eternity that we long for to be remembered long after this body dies? We all long for greatness, and Jesus actually talked about greatness. You see, the disciples, they wanted to be great too. In fact, that's some of the reason why they were actually following Jesus, is because they longed to be great. We've been going through the book of Mark, and today we're going to look at Mark chapter 10, where Jesus talks about being great. And he talks about where real greatness lies and how we can have greatness in our life. If you have your Bibles, turn to Mark chapter 10. We're going to begin reading at verse 35. It says this, it says, "Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, two of Jesus' disciples, came to him. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want you to do for us whatever we ask.'" Have you ever had someone come to you and they just say, "Hey, do you want to do me a favor?" And they just stop there, right? Have you ever had someone do that? "Kirk, will you do me a favor?" My kids would do this. "Dad, can you do a favor for me?" And do you know how I answer? "What is it?" Right? Because I know what they want. They want the $10 bill that I just put in my pocket. No, that's not true. But have you ever had someone come up and say, "Can I have a favor?" And they don't tell you what the favor is. We respond by saying, "Tell me what the favor is, and then I'll tell you if I'll do it." Jesus is just like us. You see, James and John in this moment, they have asked for a blank check. That's what they've asked Jesus for. And Jesus, who is fully human, responds like we would. He says to them, "What is it that you want from me?" And they replied, "Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory." This isn't an unrealistic request for James and John. You see, James and John were part of Jesus' disciples. They'd been there from the beginning. They had traveled with him since the very beginning. They were among the first disciples to be called by Jesus. They were part of the inner circle. Peter, James, and John, that was the inner circle. James and John were part of that. It is not an uncommon request. You see, often people would surround themselves, when they get into power, they surround themselves with people that are loyal to them, that are close to them. We see in the Old Testament, in the story of the kings, that after King David dies, his son Solomon reigns. And when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam becomes king. And Rehoboam, what he does is he takes all of his closest friends and he puts them in positions of power around him and kicks everybody that was loyal to his dad out. We see the same thing today, don't we? We see politicians, we see leaders surround themselves with their college buddies, with people that they've been friends with for many years, even their own children, right? It still happens. It's not an unreasonable request. It wasn't unreasonable back in the first century. It's not unreasonable today. James and John, they say to him, "Jesus, we would like to be at your right and your left hand, in the places of power, in the places of privilege, in the places of greatness." That's what they're asking. You see, what they've realized is that everything is about to change. That Jesus has been preaching about the kingdom of God. Kingdom of God is when everything that is broken, everything that is wrong in this world is made right and renewed. And Jesus reigns as king. And James and John have come to this place where they realize everything's about to change. And we need to talk to Jesus. We need to reserve our seats now for what is about to come. And what's been going on? It says, "Then James and John came to Jesus and asked him for a favor." And what has been going on, it actually is right before that. And in your groups this week, I want you to look at that passage and what it says. But here's what has been happening as they come to. Here's what happened before that "then" statement is made. Is that Jesus is walking with his disciples. He's walking with a larger crowd around him. And the author says, he says that the disciples were astonished at Jesus. And the crowd, they were afraid. And what's going on is that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. We talked about that last week, how everything from Mark chapter 9 on is focused on the cross. That Jesus is on his final journey, and it ends with the cross and the resurrection. And the disciples are walking with Jesus, and they are astonished. You see, Jesus has been talking clearly about his crucifixion, about his death, what is going to happen. And in fact, in this passage, it says that Jesus called the disciples together and he begins to describe in graphic detail the most descriptive statement we have about what's going to happen to Jesus before he dies. He tells his disciples, "I'm going to be flogged, I'm going to be whipped, I'm going to be handed over to the Gentiles, I'm going to be killed." And then the author says, "Then James and John come along and say, 'Jesus, can you do us a favor?'" Can you imagine? Jesus has just poured out his heart saying, "This is what's going to happen to me. These horrific things are going to happen to me." And James and John, they realize that everything's about to change. We better reserve our seats now in the kingdom. And you see, here's the thing. James and John are only focused on themselves. Their hearts are focused on themselves. And you see, a heart that is focused on itself can never hear the Messiah's voice. Jesus has just finished telling them about the awful things that are going to happen to him. And how do they respond? Yeah, that's great, Jesus, but can you reserve us a spot? Can you believe that? James and John are some of Jesus' closest friends. John, when he writes his account of Jesus' life, he refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That sounds kind of egotistical, but it's just a way of saying, I was Jesus' closest friend. And yet his response after Jesus pours his heart out and says, here's what's going to happen to me. Jesus is fully human. Do you think that he was scared? And yet in the midst of whatever he was feeling when it came to that moment, he is resolute and determined to walk towards the cross. And the disciples are astonished. How can he be resolved to do this? But James and John, they miss all of this. And they say, Jesus, yeah, that's great. I'm sorry that's going to happen to you, but can we reserve our seats now for what's going to come later? And the heart that is centered on itself can never hear the Messiah's voice. It's not malleable to the heart of the Messiah. It can't hear the whispers of the Messiah. It is just closed off from God. It is what Ezekiel calls a stone and stubborn heart. And we desperately need to have a heart that is malleable towards Jesus. Jesus continues to talk to the disciples. And he says to them, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup or be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? And so Jesus uses two metaphors that are common in the Old Testament, the cup and baptism. And the cup was often referred to when it came to suffering, to punishment, or to wrath. And Jesus says, I'm about to drink a cup of suffering, a cup of wrath, a cup of punishment. And baptism, the metaphor here, is of being completely immersed in calamity, in horrific things that he just finished explaining. And he says, I'm about to drink a cup of suffering and wrath and punishment. I'm about to have my whole life thrown into calamity, into horrific things. Can you really drink this? And James and John, who are so full of themselves, whose heart is so centered on themselves that they can't hear the Messiah's voice, and they say to him, we can. We can. In this moment, James and John, they think that they can do whatever Jesus does. That they can suffer like him, that they can be thrown into horrific calamity like he is. We can do this. And you see, a heart that is centered on itself only deceives itself. And James and John are so deceived that they think they can do things that only the Messiah can. And sometimes, more often when we think, our hearts, when they are centered on ourselves, they stop listening to the Messiah and we begin to deceive ourselves into thinking that the things around us will bring us joy. We start to think that the power and the privilege, the perks, the benefits, that these things will satisfy us. This is why Solomon, who wrote Ecclesiastes, says that God has put eternity in the hearts of men, and yet we cannot fathom it. It means we think that we can figure it out on our own. That we can fathom how to be great, how to make a name for us. We can fathom how to make ourselves happy. And so we cling to different things. We pull them towards ourselves. We search for power. We search for prestige. We search for more goods. We search for a better vacation. We search for a better spouse. We search for a better, and we search for better, and we just come up dry every single time, and we cannot fathom why we can't make ourselves happy. And it's because the heart that is centered on itself and its own appetites only deceives itself into thinking that if I only had this, it'll be okay. And James and John believe that everything will be okay if only we have the right and left seat of Jesus. And their appetites for power and for greatness deceives them. And we have the same problem. That our appetites deceive us. Jesus told a parable in Mark chapter 4. A sower went out to sow some seeds. A farmer started to throw some seeds, and he throwed it indiscriminately. Control us. The distractions of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth will keep us from becoming what Jesus envisions. And the very thing that we cling to, that we surround ourselves in, are the very things that shut us off from God himself. It makes no sense. The very thing we long for, relationship with our Creator, we destroy when we cannot control our appetites for greatness. James and John think they can go through what Jesus is going through. And Jesus says to them, you will drink the cup I will drink and be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. But to sit at my right and left is not for me to grant. He says, you know what, even though I'm going to be the king, even though I am the Messiah, who decides who sits where, or who's honored, or who is the greatest in the kingdom is not for him to decide. You see, even the greatest in the kingdom, even the king himself, Jesus, is subject to someone else, the Father. And he says it's for the Father to decide what's going to happen. These places belong to those who've been prepared for them. And then Jesus kind of ends that discussion, and the rest of the disciples, the 10, they hear what James and John asked, and guess what? They're not too happy. And it's not because they're offended for Jesus, because James and John were so insensitive as to ask for a seat at the table. You know, they get indignant with James and John. You know why? Because they didn't ask first. Because listen to what Jesus says to them. He says to them, because he hears them arguing amongst themselves, and he says, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. And the model of leadership that James and John and even the rest of the disciples had grown up with, that they were used to, is that the one who has the most power wins, the one who has the most privilege, the one who has the most possessions, that they are the greatest amongst us. And Jesus says that the mark of a kingdom citizen is different. The mark of a kingdom citizen is not like the leaders and the things that we see around us. It is living differently than the rest of the world, and the rest of the world says, give in to your appetites, it's good. You don't need to share, you don't need to stop, you don't need to give away, you don't need to sacrifice, you don't need to serve, you don't need, just all in for yourself. And the heart that is centered on self doesn't hear the Messiah's voice, and that doesn't know the truth, because the heart that is centered on self only deceives itself. Jesus says we as kingdom citizens are to live differently than the rest of the world. Jesus goes on and he says this, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus says if you want to be great, you got to be a servant. A servant is someone who's told what to do. A servant is someone who puts the needs of someone else before themselves. A slave submits their will to somebody else. They don't make their own decisions. They're told what they should and they shouldn't do. And Jesus says, if you want to be great, it's not like the rest of the world sees it. It's about service and it's about sacrifice. Here's the problem with that. We like to be served, don't we? I was reading this article on the web a few weeks ago. It was about Shoppers Drug Mart. Anybody go to Shoppers Drug Mart, right? And Shoppers Drug Mart made a decision that said, okay, we're going to tell our customers that they need to go to self-checkout. And we're not going to check them out. We'll just, if someone says, can someone help me up here at this till, we'll say, go use the self-checkout. And this article was all about this decision that they made and the backlash that was coming. And even in the comments in the threads after the article, people were livid about it. Why? We don't want to check ourselves out. We want to be served. And for some people, there is a valid reason for it. But most of us are highly capable people who can check themselves out of a store. Although don't do it, because I like to go out fast, okay? So I always use self-checkout. It's way faster because all you guys are in the other lines. But anyways, we like to be served, and people, when they couldn't be served, they're like all angry at Shoppers Drug Mart. Because they're not serving them, and we are the same way. We like our service, we like our privilege, we like our perks, we like our power, we like our prestige, we like our comfort. We want to be served. That is the mark of greatness, isn't it? Jesus doesn't say so. Jesus says the greatest will be the servant and the slave. to others. You see, the heart that is centered on Jesus finds new life in service and sacrifice. And this is what he's calling his disciples. He's calling his kingdom citizens, us, you and me, to live different than the rest of the world and discover new life in service and sacrifice. He turns things upside down. But here's the thing, he doesn't call us to do something he's not willing to do himself. Because Jesus ends this verse by saying, for even the Son of Man, that's the title that Jesus uses to refer to himself, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. You see, Jesus, who is God himself, Philippians 2 verse 5 says that we should have the same attitudes, the same mindset that was in Christ Jesus. That in our relationships with each other, we should have the same mindset as was in Christ Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, something to be held on to, but who gave it up and took the form of a servant and submitted himself even to the point of death, service and sacrifice. This is what Jesus models for us in giving his life for you, for people who don't deserve it. Since the day you were born, you have rebelled against God. You have turned your back on him. All of us have done this. And we do not deserve the sacrifice that Jesus makes, and yet he says, I will sacrifice my life for you. I will serve you. And I love the way that Mark bookends this account, this passage we've been talking through. You see, he starts out this passage with the disciples following Jesus, and they are astonished and afraid. Astonished because he is so resolute in where he's going. He is so resolved that he's going to go to the cross and give his life as a ransom for many, that the people around him are like, wow, I can't believe how resolute. He's leading the way. The crowd around him is afraid because they don't know what lays ahead, yet Jesus is leading the way. And then right after this, do you know what happens? Jesus goes into Jericho. He's on his way to Jerusalem, and Jericho is right on the way, and he's passing through Jericho, and all of a sudden he starts hearing this voice, Jesus, Son of David, Jesus, Son of David, help me. And the rest of the crowd, they don't pay any attention to him, but Jesus hears. And on his way to the cross, he says, who's calling me? Bring him here. And it's Bartimaeus, a blind beggar by the side of the road in Jericho. And Jesus, who is on his way to the cross, who is resolute and resolved that he's going to get there, and that he's going to give his life as a ransom for all. He says, be healed, Bartimaeus. I love how Mark has this story to show us that Jesus didn't come to be served. He came to serve you and me and to give his life as a ransom for you and me. And that this is the ultimate example of what service and sacrifice look like in our life. You see, the greatest in the kingdom put someone else before themselves. And Jesus, who is the greatest in the kingdom, put someone else, you and me, before himself and gave his life for us. So how do we respond today to what Jesus has just said about greatness? You know what? True greatness is not found on the path you're on. You need to understand that. True greatness is not found in the path you're on. The legacy that you want to leave is not found on the path you're on. The legacy is found on the path that Jesus leads us down. We're the greatest in the kingdom. Put someone else before themselves. We've been talking about going beyond this morning. And maybe it's time for us to get up and go beyond where we are today and to go to where Jesus is leading us. What does service and sacrifice look like in your life? We are some of the wealthiest people in the world right here. What does sacrifice look like in your life? What is service? How are you putting someone else before yourself? You know, it's easy to put our family first, okay? But do you remember when Jesus encountered his family in the book of Mark a little earlier, right? Some of you, I know you didn't like that story. Because what did Jesus say? His family comes and they say, Jesus, we'd like to see you. And Jesus says, I'm with my family here. I'm with the people who need me at this time. And Jesus' example is not putting his family first. Actually, it's putting others first. People who will never thank him, people who will never appreciate him in the same way that our families might. Putting people forward like Bartimaeus, who can never repay what Jesus did for him. That's putting someone else before yourself. People who can never repay you, who can never thank you. That is what it means to sacrifice and to serve. And you know what? Maybe you're not involved in serving. Let me give you one idea of what you can do. Right now upstairs, they're probably angry at me because we're running overtime, but right now upstairs are all our kids. Almost 100 kids meeting upstairs. And we lack leadership. We lack helpers. We lack teachers. And some of us are highly capable people who could be up there right now. You know what? Maybe the greatest contribution you're going to have to this world is not the business that you lead, not the wealth that you accumulate. Maybe the greatest contribution that you will have to this world are the people who are up there in that room. And maybe it's time that you need to serve. Let me speak specifically to guys, okay? Because I'm a guy. I think I got you figured out. Guys, we like to build things. We like to leave a legacy. We like to take risks. And guys, the greatest thing that you could ever do is help someone know Jesus. But not just that, help a child know Jesus. Because the return on investment is so great. And we don't have men serving in very many numbers. There are a few men that serve in children's ministry, but we do not have anywhere near what we need in order to help lead children to Christ. And maybe it's time to sacrifice listening to me on Sunday. I give you my blessing. Maybe it's time to give up and serve like Jesus did. Maybe it's time, maybe you've been hanging back on this going beyond stuff. You haven't been latching on to the Acts 1:8 vision. You didn't sign your name saying, I'm all in. You wouldn't give a pledge because you're just not going to do that. And maybe Jesus is talking to you and saying it's time to sacrifice and to serve because the greatest in the kingdom put someone else before themselves. And going beyond is not about us. I want you to know that. It is about the people who are going to come here and find Jesus. It is about people who will never sit in these chairs or drive on this parking lot who are going to find Jesus. That's what going beyond is all about. And maybe it's time for you to get all in and be a part of what Jesus is doing, to put someone else before yourself. And it may cost you a new car. It may cost you a vacation. It may cost you, I don't know. Jesus knows. And he's not scared. And maybe he's talking to you right now. And you need to respond in some way. How can you go beyond? The greatest in the kingdom puts someone else before themselves. How do you need to respond today? There's a story of a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I love his life story. I've read his biography, and it's a wonderful story. And he lived in the 1930s and 40s, and 20s, I guess, as well. But he is a German Christian who moved from Germany to New York. And after going to school, he was offered a great job, a prestige job that paid very well, but he saw what was happening in his country, in Germany, with the rise of Nazism. And he said, I need to go back, and I need to bring light into dark places in Germany. And in the height of Nazism, he moves from the safety and security of New York to Germany, where he speaks out against Nazism, where he shines a light and helps people in desperate need, and is arrested and imprisoned and is executed 1 month before World War II ends. The greatest in the kingdom puts someone else before themselves. What do you need to do today? I want to invite the worship team to come back up and sing our closing song.